Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome, or thank you for showing up for John C. Fremont's Western Expeditions. But here I must confess I'm not an authority on John C. Fremont. When Ashley was making out a list of proposed subjects for presentation at the conference, unbeknownst to me, alongside Fremont's name, he put my name. And of course, I didn't want to say no to Ashley Hall, so here I am. And also, thanks to Nicole Dominguez, the Nevada chair, for introducing me to PowerPoint. This is my first experience with it, so I thought if I can walk and chew gum at the same time, I can talk and show pictures at the same time. Okay, John C. Fremont had a long and varied career in politics in California and Washington. He also spent many years exploring the West. This talk will mainly cover his Western expeditions, most notably his second expedition, traveling the Old Spanish Trail. This is in keeping with the conference theme, Builders of the Trail. Fremont was born into poverty January 21st, 1813 in Savannah, Georgia. His earliest years were spent wandering from town to town, state to state. Fremont died July 13, 1890 of peritonitis at the age of 77 in New York. Fremont's appointments were military governor of California, January 1847 to February 1847, United States Senator from California, 1850 to 51, the fifth governor of the Arizona Territory, 1878 to 1881, and presidential candidate in 1856. Fremont was the first Republican candidate for president. He was narrowly defeated by James Buchanan. In 1841, Fremont married Jessie Benton, who would later edit all his reports and adapt well to his erratic lifestyle. Jessie was the daughter of the powerful and well-connected Senator Thomas Benton. Initially, Benton was against their marriage because Fremont was not considered upper society. But in time, Benton believed wholeheartedly in Western expansion and supported Fremont's expeditions out west. That's Thomas Benton on the right there. John C. Fremont was excellent at reporting details of his explorations, such as the flora, fauna, topography, mapping, and trail conditions. He used colorful descriptions and had an eye for the picturesque. Fremont was able to make good use of these talents during his 5 major surveying and scientific expeditions out west. His main purpose was to find a suitable railroad route west and improving existing wagon roads. 3 of these Western expeditions were government funded. His last 2 were privately funded, and both ended in mishaps. It's noted by some that Fremont occasionally lacked discipline and defects in judgment. It was also noted that he delighted in dangerous and reckless behavior. He was never to overcome these personality traits. Fremont's published maps and journals and scientific documentation of his expeditions served as a guide for thousands of American immigrants traveling west. From his explorations, he was popularly known as the Pathfinder. By By 1838, a select group of senators and politicians in Washington were pushing for westward expansion. So at age 29, Fremont's political connections enabled him to be chosen to lead his first of 5 western expeditions. For this first expedition, Fremont needed an experienced guide familiar with the West. While traveling up the Missouri River at the start of his first expedition, he happened to meet Kit Carson. He looks more like a senator there than a trapper. Well, Fremont was so impressed with Carson that he immediately hired him as his guide. Carson's association with Fremont made him famous. Carson gave Fremont his solid loyalty. They remained friends until Carson's death in 1868. For Fremont's first expedition, I already said that. Okay, in 1843, Fremont began his second expedition out west to learn more about California. This is the most noteworthy one for us, as he was the first American explorer to document a portion of the old Spanish Trail. He traveled from west going east. His expedition assembled on the banks of the Missouri River near present-day Kansas City. Fremont set out with 39 men, including the famous mountain man, Thomas Fitzpatrick. There he is, looking like a mountain man. Thomas Fitzpatrick was his guide. Also in tow was a controversial howitzer cannon, which is said to be abandoned somewhere in the foothills of the northern Nevada-California border. I think I'd like to go look for that. Kit Carson, returning to Bent's Fort near the base of the Rocky Mountains, joined Fremont's group here to again serve as scout and hunter, along with another well-known scout, Alexis Cody. The group traveled on to Oregon and the Columbia River, then traveled through northern Nevada to reach California. After a near fatal crossing of the Sierras, the group reached Sutter's Fort to recuperate. Fremont then re-equipped his expedition with 130 horses, mules, and a small herd of cattle. In March of 1844, Fremont and his men left Sutter's Fort, and because the Sierras were still snowbound, they headed south towards the Mojave Desert. About his outfit, Fremont made the following observation: our cavalcade made a strange and grotesque appearance, guided by a civilized Indian and 2 wild ones. We had our own mixture of American, French, and German, with 4 or 5 languages being spoken at once. We had all matters of dress and appearance, and were also accompanied by half-wild stock. The group reached the Tehachapi Mountains, where they met an Indian from the San Fernando Mission, who offered directions to an old Indian trail, which they followed to the Mojave River. At this point, on April 20th, 1844, Fremont noted in his diary that after continually being forced south by mountains and deserts, a general shout announced that we had struck the object of our search, the Spanish Trail. The name stuck. Before that, it had simply been called a trail to New Mexico or California, depending on your direction of travel. Fremont reached the Mojave River at a point near historic Lanes Crossing by present-day Victorville. Fremont describes the Mojave River as a clear, bold stream, 60 feet wide and several feet deep, which doesn't sound like the Mojave River today. It ran between naked banks of sand. Well, that does. Fremont then followed along the Mojave River to an area just past present-day Barstow, where he met some Mojave Indians who mentioned a trail to the Colorado River. That was a Mojave Road. It's not clear if Fremont decided to take this trail to the river, but his journal does state he was on an Indian trail just past where the trail split near the Mojave River. And this is known as Forks in the Road. Here, while camped, the group was surprised by the appearance of two Mexicans. The man, Andres Fuentes, and a boy, Pablo Hernandez, had escaped a massacre at Resting Springs. This incident put Fremont back on the Spanish Trail, and you'll hear more about this a little later. Fremont and his party then continued on to the next water source at Bitter Springs. It's now inaccessible and located within the boundaries of Fort Irwin. Fremont named the spring Agua de Tomaso. He also wrote, there were few bushes and very little grass, but the water was refreshing to us under a burning sun. If it's Bitter Springs, I don't understand how the water was refreshing. After another jornada, or waterless stretch, which took them to Salt Creek Springs, Fremont said of the spring, this was a swampy, salty spot with a small amount of unwholesome grass and water too salty to drink, and only useful to wet the mouth. All around were skeletons of horses. The Salt Springs area it's a very interesting area. Behind the springs are the ruins of the historic Salt Springs gold mine that was discovered by travelers on the old Spanish Trail in the 1850s. Also, it's here where the Wade family exited out of Death Valley and intersected the old Spanish Trail. They and others split from a wagon train near Parowan, Utah to take a shortcut, winding up in Death Valley. The Wade family is the only party to survive Death Valley intact with wagon and oxen. From Salt Creek Springs, Fremont turned right and continued in a northerly direction up the Amargosa riverbed. That's the Amargosa riverbed, and in case you didn't know, it's a national wild and scenic river. I can resist that. But anyway, the Amargosa River, which in Spanish means bitter water, it flows down from Beatty, Nevada, about 150 miles, makes a U-turn at Salt Creek Springs, and flows into Badwater in Death Valley. Now this area, and Jack Pritchard touched on this yesterday, this area is controversial between his diary and the lay of the land. By some, it's accepted that he went up the fork to the springs at present-day China Day Ranch, and others believed it was up the fork through Amargosa Canyon, which was later transversed by the immigrant wagon trains. Fremont describes in his diary, while gradually ascending the ravine, it then opened into a green valley, At the foot of the mountains were springs of excellent water. And that description matches China Day Ranch, but I've hiked down Amargosa River Canyon. There's no springs of excellent water. There's a lot of water seeps, and of course Amargosa is unfit to drink. From here, it's a barren stretch of 7 miles to the oasis known as the Archuleta. I'm not sure the pronunciation of that. Here Fremont noted, today on April 29th, we reached the Archuleta, where the Mexican party had been attacked. We descended into a sandy plain or basin, in the middle of which was a grassy spot with springs and willow bushes that constitute a camping place in the desert. Because of the massacre at the springs, Fremont named them Agua de Hernandez. And at this point, I'm going to pause for a minute, because when I was at Spanish Trail Park the other evening for our icebreaker, I met a member of the Old Spanish Trail, Claudio, and he told me a story about his ancestors were involved in the massacre at Resting Springs. So I'm going to let him, instead of me talking about it, I'm going to let him describe what happened.
It was an interesting manner in how we found out about. Oh, okay.
Is this being video? Sorry.
Oh,
It was an interesting manner in which I found out about the family ancestry, about the involvement there at Resting Springs, and how our family almost was eradicated. Grandpa Santiago, who would have been my great-great-grandfather, was born in Abiquiu, and then later on moved to Peña Blanca. And the significance of that is that Peña Blanca was the origin of Antonio Armijo's family. And the significance of that was that Grandpa Santiago apparently had a relationship with one of the Armijo women, and his son, Serafin, was born out of wedlock, and he landed up being my great-great-grandfather. He was a survivor of that particular incident. He started after the what we call the renganche, and renganche means like a party or a group of people, and that's how we used to refer the groups that would travel to California. Along the way, they're probably around the Ghost Ranch, if you're familiar with northern New Mexico. He was spotted. He was probably about 11 or 12 years old, and they told my Grandpa Santiago that he was following the party, so they in turn he returned him back to Abiquiu, so he never accompanied him on the trip. When they left Abiquiu, apparently it was about in January, and they traveled to California, traded for the horses, and as they were returning, they stopped at Resting Springs. This is what everything seems to indicate, that they were at Resting Springs when they were attacked. They had taken a side trip from the main caravan, and it was in the books, in Bremerton's journals, who was writing for Fremont, they listed him as Santiago Giacome, which happens to be an Italian name. And it was, all our stories indicate that that was my grandfather, Santiago, that was there, not Santiago Giacome. So we've got on those premises all this time. While they were there, they had split off with a group of about 30 horses, and they were scouted by this different group of Indians. We think they may have been Southern Paiute, Anyway, the following day, as there was two of the riders that were herding the horses, or what they call night watch. They were attacked by this group of Indians, which may have been about 100 people. Grandpa Santiago told them to stampede the horses through them so to see if they could break up the attack and divert them, but it didn't. The two people that were on horseback was Hernandez, this young man named Hernandez, and another man named Fuentes. And they were able to escape because they were horseback. The remaining party was attacked where they were at the springs, and all of them were killed. And here in Bremerton's journals, it describes what happened with the bodies. They were mutilated, and the stories that we got later on from the remaining people that followed after the party says that the women were tortured. You know, it just probably the best way to place it. So the two remaining survivors on horseback met up with Fremont and Kit Carson, and they returned to Resting Springs, where they followed the party of horse thieves and caught up with them and exacted some revenge. But the interesting part about it, had my Grandpa Serafin not been returned, I'm sure he would have probably been one of the people that didn't survive that. And that's probably about the gist of it all. I returned many years later, of course, and Liz Warren, who I met here through the OSTA, was gracious enough to take me to Resting Springs. And I had some holy water, and we arrived at the site, and where I just took it to look like the prettiest place. I blessed the area, because my Grandpa Santiago had been left along with everybody else unburied and mutilated, and to me it was just a cleansing that the family needed. The family had always been concerned about the story and concerned about how his demise was, and so it brought some closure to us. It was a very meaningful trip for me, and I was always real thankful to Liz Warren for taking the trouble to take me. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio.
Any questions?
Oh, yeah, any questions here?
Yes, sir. Yeah, do you know how old, or have any idea how old the two survivors were? Were they boys or maybe young men? From genealogy, do you have any idea?
I think the Hernandez boy was probably 11 or 12, is very young. And from what I understand, I think he was adopted by somebody within the military group there. And after that, don't know what occurred, but they were the only two survivors. And Fuentes, still a common name in New Mexico, and I don't really know what transpired with him, how old he was. Apparently he was a mature man.
Okay, thank you, Claudio. That's quite a story. Well, after Fremont's group spent some time at Resting Springs, they regrouped and then continued northward over Immigrant Pass. Now, the top of Immigrant Pass is really a fascinating place. You're able to see the wagon trace. That's it on the right, ascending up to Immigrant Pass. There it is on the other side, following the ridge down towards Resting Springs. And this is the pack mule trace. It's kind of blurry there, but there it is, descending down off Immigrant Pass, going towards Resting Springs. Traveling from Immigrant Pass to Stump Springs, Fremont, noted before us, stretched a high range, rising still higher to the left. It terminated in a snowy mountain peak. This is Mount Charleston. It's about 12,000 feet in elevation. Las Vegas Valley is just on the other side of that. This area of the Fremont traveled from Resting Springs through Pahrump Valley is now known as the Spanish Trail Highway. And there's some of the signage you see alongside the highway. On April 30th, 1844, the group arrived at Stump Springs. That's the interpretive kiosk alongside the highway. Stump Springs is about a mile off the highway down a dirt road. Stump Springs is actually located in a desert wash and was always an uncertain source of water. The aquifer depends on the runoff from the nearby Spring Mountains. Here, Fremont noted the grass was almost as scarce as the water. Okay, the picture on the left is an older photo I found. You do see a big stump there. Whether that's original, I have no idea. When I first visited Stump Springs, you did see a big stump in the wash there. The photo on the right I took about in the same place, and as you can see, it's all overgrown with mesquite trees. And there was water running in the wash because there had been some rain on the nearby Spring Mountains. On May 1st, 1844, the group crossed Pahrump Valley and ascended the long slope of the Spring Mountain Range, traveling over rocks and gravel, wearing the horses' hooves down to the point some could hardly travel. Now that's the slope ascending up to the Spring Mountain Range, and as you can see a Spanish Trail marker there. I think Hayden covered that yesterday as well. And the photo on the right shows the trace a little bit better. I believe that's a wagon trace, and I believe the mule trace was probably in the same spot because it was a flat, open area. Okay, this is the trace, and Mount Springs Pass is right about right in here. So it came over the mountains and came down this way. Okay, the group finally arrived at the springs near the summit of Mountain Springs Pass. Here, Fremont states, we camped at a spring in the pass, which had been the site of an old Indian village. We found excellent grass, but little water. I took this photo earlier this year. There's no standing water, but there is some spring seeps, and it's like a little oasis. It's very green and surrounded by trees, but it is on private property. And when you get to the top of Mountain Springs Pass, this is what you see. The Spanish Trail cutouts, and I love the mule on the end. Then descending down off of Mountain Springs Pass, these ruts used to be very visible, but now they've disappeared under highway construction, and I don't know what else going on in the pass. After 12 miles of rough riding down the western slope of the Spring Mountains, they arrived at Cottonwood Springs, where Blue Diamond Village now stands, and that's the site of tonight's dinner. Fremont noted after a rough ride, we descended into a small valley plain. We camped at the foot of a ridge on the bed of a creek where we found sufficient grass in quantity and an abundance of water in holes. The ridge presented a continuous high precipice. Now, this journal entry is somewhat confusing. He mentions he camped at the foot of a ridge on the bed of the stream. That matches Blue Diamond, and that's the stream there. Actually, I took that photo from my front yard. But he does mention he found sufficient water in holes. And if he's camped by the side of the spring, what does he need water in holes? Generally, water in holes means a Tanaha, and you don't find those in Blue Diamond, but you do find them at the foot of the Red Rock Escarpment. Now, this area that Fremont traveled from Mountain Springs Pass down to Cottonwood Springs is now known as the Red Rock National Conservation Area. And the ridge Fremont mentioned, that's the Red Rock Escarpment in the back, and there's only, a couple of places that you can get over that. This whole area now is a network of mountain bike trails and hiking trails. There's the trailhead there, and you see more of the metal cutouts in the background. The trail from, the Spanish Trail from this trailhead down into Cottonwood Springs has now been folded into a network of mountain bike trails, as you can see by the sign there. On May 3rd, after an 18-mile ride, the group arrived at Big Springs at Las Vegas, which in Spanish means meadows. The area had the best water, grazing, and camping spots of any place along the trail. Okay, now, Fremont descending from Mountain Springs down to Cottonwood Springs and Las Vegas Valley, this is the view he would have had. Right. Okay, so coming down from Mountain Springs, Fremont would have went right around this little rock outcropping there, and there's a pass in between this high bluff there. Right at the base of the bluff is Cottonwood Springs and Blue Diamond. And you see down, this is Las Vegas Valley, you can see the hotels on the strip on the south end. Las Vegas Springs is more towards the north end of the valley. So as he exited Cottonwood Springs, he would have run around this way into the north end. Then the trail would have went over the ridge here, which is basically the route of Interstate 15 as it exit out of Las Vegas Valley. Fremont is the first person known to blaze and document this portion of the old Spanish Trail leading to Big Springs in the Las Vegas Valley. Prior to that, Armijo went around the extreme south end of the valley through Good Springs, over Wilson Pass. A few others traveled down the Colorado River to follow the Mojave Road. Fremont describes Las Vegas Springs as two narrow streams of clear water, 4 or 5 feet deep, that gush suddenly from two large springs. The taste of the water is good, but rather too warm to be agreeable, the temperature being in the 70s. They, however, afforded a delightful bathing place. The water boiled up with such great force that the bather was kept suspended in the water. And there's bathers suspended in the water, and that had to be the early 1900s because you can see a horse and buggy in the background.
How close is that spring to the old Mormon fort that we went to last night?
It's, a couple of miles actually?
How close is that?
How close are the springs to the Mormon fort? It's The Mormon fort kind of sits down in a ravine. The springs flowed from up above that.
The big spring flowed by the fort about 4 miles northeast. The spring is right by the expressway that goes to Reno. In fact, there's a big sign that says Spring Preserve right over that wall of the spring.
The Las Vegas Springs site was also an Anasazi Indian site. This area has been preserved by the city of Las Vegas, and it's now called the Springs Preserve and open to the public. Now, these photos I took earlier this year, that's a collapsed spring house. To the right, there is still streams and ponds from Big Springs because it's on the Springs Preserve. Early day Las Vegas depended on Big Springs for their water source. That spring house was part of that, and that probably dates to the early 1900s. There's a well derrick in the background that was used for supplying water to early day Las Vegas. And that's the entrance to the Springs Preserve. If you've never been there, it's worth a visit. On May 4th, Fremont and his men now face the longest dry march of the trail. From Las Vegas Springs, they traveled through the desert, down California Wash, to a place known as the California Crossing on the Muddy River. And this area that he traveled between Las Vegas Springs and the Muddy River is now the location of a proliferation of solar fields. Not pretty, but we'll probably see more of them. Also, that area on the old Spanish Trail Highway I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of proposed solar fields going in there, and I think Jack Pritchard is working with that situation. Instead of starting out late afternoon from Las Vegas Springs, when his travel would extend through the cooler temperatures of the night, Fremont started out in the morning and had to deal with the intense daytime heat. It's a small wonder that he wrote, along the way, skeletons of animals dotted the trail, and it was a dry jornada, which proved the longest we had made in our journey, between 50 and 60 miles, without a drop of water. The heated air seemed entirely deprived of moisture. After a hard, uninterrupted march of 16 hours, our wild mules began running ahead. In a mile or so, we came to a bold running stream, the milk-colored Muddy River. There's the milk-colored Muddy River. The Spaniards used the melodious name of Rio de Los Angeles, and the Indians used the name Moab. The men had little rest here while trying to recuperate, for the thieving Paiutes swarmed into camp, threatening lives and property. Using diplomacy, they escaped injury by yielding some horses for feast meat. Fremont referred to the Indians as Arabs of the desert that followed us like a pack of wolves, ready to pounce on any animal or man that fell behind. Leaving the Muddy River, Fremont and his men then traveled up the sandy incline to reach the top of what is now called the Mormon Mesa. You can see the top there, and you can, trying to learn how to work this clicker here.
If you look at the left side of the photograph, you'll see some lighter colored rocks. That's the old Spanish Trail coming off the mesa. For those who are north of us tomorrow, we'll stop and take a look at that.
Yeah, that's a trace coming off the mesa down to the Muddy River.
It's the one over to the end. The old road goes up this way. The old Spanish Trail comes directly off. That's a dugway going up to the top of the mesa on west east side.
Leaving the Muddy River, Fremont and his men then traveled, okay, I've already told you about that. Okay, after a 20-mile stretch across the top of the Mormon Mesa, they descended down to the Virgin River, and that's, as Ashley mentioned, going up to the top of the mesa. That's later been burned up by the wagon trains, but it was such a steep climb that they had to double team the wagons to get to the top of the mesa. And the top of the mesa is, there's cap rock there, and the dirt or roads at the bottom of it, so it was very difficult to get up there on top of the mesa. When they reached the Rio Virgin, as Fremont called it, Fremont noted, "It's the most dreary river I had ever seen. The rampant river was roily with spring flood. The pale prickly salt grass afforded poor grazing, and the last remaining steers, being entirely given out, were butchered." And the Virgin River, it kind of fans out, and that's just one channel of it. I couldn't get the whole river in the picture. And okay, that's the Mormon Mesa there in the background. That's Cap Rock I was talking about. And the Spanish Trail would have went around the bottom here, went up through a ravine here to get on top of the mesa. This is near the present town of Mesquite, Nevada, which is a Mormon farming community, or was. Now it's more of a retirement community. But the old Mormon farmers used to say of the Muddy River that it's too thick to drink and too thin to plow. After several days of slow travel up the Virgin River, Fremont and his men arrived at the present site of Littlefield, Arizona. Here, Baptiste Chabot, while riding back for a lame mule, was attacked and killed by Indians. They stripped his body and threw it into the river, then took his horse, gun, and clothes and disappeared. Leaving the river at Beaver Dam Wash at Littlefield, they followed the approximate route of the old Highway 91, ascending the slope of the Beaver Dam Mountains. And at Castledale, which was an old motorist stop, you do see these cutouts. They're quite impressive to see. Old Highway 91 predated Interstate 15, which now goes through the Virgin River Narrows. Fremont then crossed over the mountains and camped on the banks of the Santa Clara River. Traveling up the river the next day, the changing scenery was a welcome sight as the desert was now behind them. On May 12th, Fremont arrived at Mountain Meadows, then known as Las Vegas de Santa Clara. Fremont describes this meadow as being on the divide between the Great Basin and the Colorado Plateau. Describing this valley, he noted, "We found here an extensive mountain meadow, rich in bunch grass and fresh numerous springs. All were refreshing and delightful to look upon," as you can tell by the photo there. His visit was prior to the immigrant massacre that occurred there in 1857. But Fremont's final conclusion as to the existence of the Great Basin was made while traveling the old Spanish Trail between California and Utah. Instead of returning home by way of Santa Fe as originally planned, Fremont decided to go home by way of northern Utah. He wanted to finalize his thoughts about the Great Basin and the implications it would have on travel to California. This trip had also disproved the long-standing legend of a Buenaventura River flowing out of the Great Basin to the west coast. Fremont eventually reached the Little Salt Lake near the present town of Parowan. On May 17th, Fremont noted, after 440 miles of traveling on the trail, we were opposite a gap in a chain of mountains, which were the Wasatch, through which the Spanish Trail passes. We again found ourselves exploring a track through the wilderness. And that's a Little Salt Lake. It's a dry lake bed now, but I believe in Spanish Trail days it did have water. At this same time, Joseph Walker, the famous mountain man, was traveling the trail, and from signs, he perceived that Fremont's party was just ahead of him, so he pushed on to meet up with the group. Walker now became Fremont's guide, as he was more familiar with this country than the present guides, Carson, Fitzpatrick, and Godey. On the way home, Fremont crossed the mountains at Spanish Fort Canyon, stopped at Rubidoux Fort, then continued eastward to the North Platte, descending the Arkansas River, and reached Kansas City. This was the end of his second expedition. Kit Carson also left Fremont at this time, but he later returned on his own to travel the entire trail in 1847 and again in 1848. Fremont's detailed reports and maps of his 1843-44 expedition were published and widely distributed. They were also instrumental in collecting all the bits and pieces of the old Spanish Trail into a cohesive whole. Fremont's reports documentation made the name Spanish Trail popular, but it's controversial whether he ever used the term Old Spanish Trail. All his journal entries only use the name Spanish Trail. Fremont's diary and maps relating to the trail also provided guidance for the Mormons to turn the old Spanish Trail, going from southern Utah to California, into a passable wagon road, now referred to as the Mormon or California Road. The Mormons also used this information to establish Mormon communities along the way. The War Department's plan for Fremont's third expedition in 1845-46 was to survey designated areas of the West. Fremont organized and armed a surveying party of 60 men, with Carson as guide and Walker and Godey as scouts. On this expedition, Fremont was secretly told by the Secretary of the Navy that if war started with Mexico, he was to turn his scientific expedition into a military force. During this time, Fremont's involvement in the California Bear Flag Rebellion resulted in a quarrel with Brigadier General Kearney. As a result, Fremont was humiliated by being arrested and court-martialed. He was found guilty on some of the charges and innocent on others. Later, all charges were dismissed by President Polk. Fremont later resigned his position as an Army officer. Fremont's fourth expedition in 1848-49 was promoted by his father-in-law, Senator Benton, and financed by St. Louis businessmen. The purpose was to locate a central railroad route across the southern Rockies along the 38th parallel, connecting St. Louis to San Francisco. During this wintertime crossing of the Rockies, several mules died, as well as 10 men who perished from cold and exhaustion. Also, 2 men were killed by Ute Indians, so this was not one of Fremont's finest moments. Fremont's fifth and final expedition in 1853-54 was taken at private expense, and again to finish locating a central railroad route to the Pacific coast. The party journeyed between Missouri and San Francisco. The primary objective was to pass through the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada Mountains during the wintertime to document the amount of snow and the feasibility of a winter rail passage. For some unknown reason, Fremont did not mind winter mountain crossings, which would create severe hardships for his men and loss of much livestock. Traveling in December of 1853, Fremont's party followed the Santa Fe Trail heading west, then eventually followed the north branch of the Old Spanish Trail and continued west into central Utah, traversing Rabbit Valley. Here they cached equipment at a site near the present town of Fremont, Utah. This booty that they cached would eventually wind up in the possession of Chief Wakar, the famous Ute Indian chief. Well, by this time, their food supplies were exhausted as they struggled across the Wasatch Mountains south of Fish Lake. They then traveled down Otter Creek to finally arrive at the Old Spanish Trail, Mormon Road, in early February of 1854. Here the group was finally rescued from starvation by the Mormons from the community of Parowan. And ironically, it was Fremont's earlier published travel report that influenced the settling of Parowan along the Old Spanish Trail. And had the town not been there, Fremont's party would have probably perished. After spending 2 weeks in Parowan to regain strength, the party continued across the Great Basin to California. By this time, Fremont was eager to get back east, so he soon left for New York in April of 1854. This was the end of Fremont's western explorations. On February 10, 1847, during the gold rush era, Fremont purchased 70 square miles of land in the Sierra foothills called Las Mariposas for $3,000. Fremont was later informed that gold had been discovered on his property, and he was instantly a wealthy man. Later in life, Fremont invested heavily in railroads, but the Panic of 1873 wiped out his fortune. It was said thereafter that his appearance had aged considerably. In the later part of Fremont's career, he was appointed governor of the Arizona Territory by President Hayes. He served from 1878 to 1881. However, he spent little time in Arizona and was asked to resume his duties in person or resign. Fremont chose resignation. After this incident, Fremont retired from politics. Although often caught up in controversy, Fremont's adventures, his misadventures, and writing made him one of the best-known Americans of his time. His biographer, Alan Nevins, wrote that Fremont lived a dramatic life full of remarkable successes and some dismal failures. Fremont's popularity can be measured by the proliferation of places named Fremont, such as Fremont Wash, Stream, River, Mountain Pass, State Park, Fremont Indians, and the list goes on. Also, there's a few communities named Fremont, as well as numerous streets named Fremont. But probably the most notable name of all, and located not far from the Old Spanish Trail in downtown Las Vegas, is Fremont Street. I think Fremont would have loved it. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Glenn. Excellent. Enjoyed it immensely. Wanted to call your attention to something that many of you may not know. We have in our library Solomon Nunez Carvalho's original diary of the 5th expedition of Fremont, which is the only known diary that details from east to west the entire old Spanish Trail. This is a scientific end of the Fremont display. He was also a derographer, if you pronounce that, and so he was photographing the entire trail then, all the way back. He was also at Parowan, as indicated, when they had the fiasco, and Solomon was left behind to go to recover at Salt Lake with Brigham Young. He then continued his diary all the way to California before returning back to the east coast of the United States by way of the vessel around the Horn. He is also known by a kind of a strange coincidence. He is the inventor of ammoniacal compression and was the founder of a little-known company by the name of Westinghouse, and he invented air conditioning. That's this guy. On the way down, on his way, he took 2 sets of photography pieces of equipment, and he left 2 collections of the Fremont expedition that were never found. He left one of them with the Smithsonian Institute when he returned back to the East Coast. They have never found it. A short time ago, not very long ago, someone walked into a pawn shop in Seattle with a box of daguerreotype slides. They're all published, not all of them, but they're in Sights Unseen that Mark has. That's why I'm holding this up. And you can see the photographs of the original Old Spanish Trail taken by Solomon Nunez Carvalho on this presentation, on this trip. They're phenomenal, they're excellent reading. You can see at firsthand what it looked like in 1851, and then you can follow the diary for the experiences. The coincidence is that this is only like a year or 2 old, and so these you don't see published or available in any of the other talks or those other things. So if you want to see the Old Spanish Trail as it really was, I'd suggest this. And the other one is, of all of the authors of the Old Spanish Trail, Solomon Nunez Carvalho is the most prolific. He's the most easily understood. He is an excellent author, and it's just doggone fun to read. So I want to commend these to the group, and we've kept these in sale for heavens for a good long while. Over to you.
I have not a question, but a comment. Glenn, you mentioned Stump Spring and showed a couple pictures. I have a friend, and he's a member of our chapter, named Bill Helmer, and when he was in college in 1970, he decided to document Old Stump Springs. So he went there and camped out and then walked a portion of the trace. But he took photos, and I have his photo of the last 3 poplar trees, large trees there at Stump Springs. And he went back a couple years later and said 2 of them had gone down. So it shows you the drying that we've had over the last 40, 50 years. But I have that picture, and it's one of my favorite things.
Len, question for you. First of all, my compliments on the presentation, very comprehensive. For not being a Fremont expert, you're more of an expert than me, so please take that into consideration in the answer to the question. I've always sort of jokingly but seriously referred to Fremont not as the pathfinder, but as the path follower. It seems to me that his first 3 expeditions by the government were sent out, and he was literally following immigrants in wagons and then documenting as he followed, or places that were already known, but his job was to document them. It occurs to me that once he starts his private expeditions, where he's really blazing in some areas new paths, he gets himself in humongous tragedy, especially in the fourth one. Do you think there's any connection either between the fact that he wasn't much of a pathfinder, or was it because he was working for the government and he had different restrictions?
Hey, you're on my time.
Sorry, Ashley.
Got something to say,
It was a question, Ashley.
Anybody have an answer for that question? Glenn?
I don't know if I can answer it completely, but I think he was on direction from the people that finance some of the private ones, or the government. So, you know, he was following these paths to accomplish what his goals were. As far as private exploration, you know, I really don't know.
Thank you.
I have a quick comment. You'll notice that Fremont referred to resting springs as Archulette. He was half French. I learned the other day, I was out with an archaeologist, John Horn from Alpine Archaeology in Montrose. He referred to himself as Fremont, not Fremont. So if you want to be persnickety and pedantic, you too can refer to him as Fremont.
All right, anything else? Claudia, you good? Okay. All right, thank you so much, Glenn.